All right, well, it's 1 o'clock, so maybe we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to the very first County Clerks virtual session. In fact, this is the very first, what we're calling session that we have done. We're kind of excited about getting these started. We're hoping to do these short little things every now and again so that we can get important, valuable information out to you guys as we get it. So first things first, I just want to do a little housekeeping items. When you came into the WebEx, if you came in on a computer, your video was disabled and your microphones were muted. I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. It helps with our broadband and trying to make sure that we have more of a solid service without interruptions, okay? The chat feature is the one that some of you guys have been using, answering questions, helping us as we were setting up. If you have just logged on and can't find the chat, it's a little bit different. It is in the bottom right-hand corner. There's just a chat with a little, I don't know, speak box, you know, the little boxes. If you click on that, it should open up the chat box. So you should be able to see. If you are wanting everyone to see it, you need to make sure there's a little to box. Make sure that says everyone in it. On the slide, it does say all participants. We have since got a WebEx update, and now it says everyone, which I like a little bit better.
Yeah.
Personally. So anyway, we will be monitoring any questions that you have as as we're going through all of this. Send them in. We're going to try and answer them, throughout the presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end, okay, for some other Q&As. If chat is not something you can do, maybe you're on a cell phone or you're on a landline, but you're near a computer. If you would like, you can email us at counties@sboa.in.gov. Our normal counties box, I've got that up as well, so I'll be monitoring that as we go along as well. The session is going to be recorded. So what we're going to do is we'll record the whole thing. It should be a quicker turnaround than what we've done with some of our larger days that we've done, since we're just doing, an hour and a half, maybe something like that, maybe 2 hours, depending on where this goes. Once we're done here, it takes it about a day to save up to the cloud and to give me access. Once I get access, I hand that over to our IT person to kind of clean it up a little bit. Like the talking in the front, we'll get rid of most of that so that we just start it here. And then we'll get it put up on the website. Once we get it put up on the website, I will send out mass emails to let you all know that it's available for your viewing at that time. I also want to, which I didn't put on here, but I thought about it. When we decided to set up this session, we have just switched to a new Gov delivery distribution. So we have these lists, distribution lists, and so when we send out memos or like this, like a session, or if we have a conference, this is the platform we're going to be using. So I went through the, your Clerks directory. I have inputted all of the emails that I could inside that, got you saved. If you got an email from me outside of that, where I had to send it to you separately, it means at some point, using the eGov delivery, you unsubscribe. So like, Department of Local Government Finance uses this system. There's some other agencies. If you unsubscribe somewhere, we think that blocks us from adding you. You can add yourself. So I did send out something yesterday with directions on how to do that. If you didn't receive that or you have questions about it, again, send me an email. Let's get you started. We don't send out things daily. We only send out important things, memos, information you need, directives that come out, bulletins. We only release those quarterly, so you're talking 4 there. If we were to make any kind of manual update, again, a session. So I sent the original session out through that. It kind of looks like a memo. We've tried to, make it look a little bit more professional looking. So if you had any question about getting it, whether or not it was from us, it was. So any questions with that, please email us. We're trying to get everybody switched over that because we do not want you to miss out on any information that comes out of the office. Okay? All right. Well, the next thing I kind of want to touch on was just a little bit of COVID-19. It has really thrown us kind of for a loop. Oh, sorry. Brad, you are muted, but I'll unmute you in just a second. So the COVID-19, like I said, threw us all for a loop. This was something, totally not planned. We knew that there were some things that were going on, and we have been really trying to keep our head above water with all of this. It's been a lot. So we know, from our end it's been a lot, but we know with you guys being right there on the ground, in the buildings, dealing with the public, we can't even imagine what you guys are going through. So I'm sure you guys are right there, and hopefully we can kind of help alleviate this going into the next election. That's what this whole thing is kind of set up for. We do suggest, though, that even though we're not going to go over it here, we have talked about with some other groups about putting in a continuity plan, okay? If something were to happen, I think Jasper County, you guys are closed down. Putting in some sort of plan so that your office can still be running. If you have any questions about that, or you just kind of want to brainstorm with Lori and I, if you'd like to give us a call, we can kind of go over that in more detail. But I do want to throw it out there because your office is vital. To shut it down and not do anything, how do you do that? I mean, you guys know, you understand. So we want to help you guys, and in this new climate that we are, we are working on just trying to make it as easy as possible for you guys to have a plan in place so that when this emergency happens, or if your county is to shut down, you can still continue on with some operations. The next thing I was going to talk about was the June annual conference. So we've gotten quite a few questions that came in about this. So what has happened is it's probably like April and May, we got with the association to talk about the June annual conference. And at that time, everything was still shut down. And we did not feel like it was a safe way to bring everybody in to do that conference at the time. And so we decided that, as a group, that we needed to, postpone it. It just really hasn't come back to where we are doing any in-person conferences. So it just kind of got, moved to the side at this point. And so we decided that for you guys, we were really interested in doing these sessions, and we really wanted to put just that important, pertinent information out for this year. As for next year, barring anything else crazy that could happen, and hopefully 2020 is it, and 2021 is going to be glorious, okay? And we're all going to come out of hiding. The plans are still to have your June conference for next year. That is what we are hoping for. That is what we're going to be trying for, unless something, again, crazy happens. We will try to be in contact with you. We'll be working with the association to make this happen. We hate not getting together in person. We have missed everybody. We have not done one conference in person this year. It's very sad for us too. This gives us time to kind of network with you guys. For me especially, I've only been in front of you one time. So to get to know your faces with your names and, kind of build that relationship has been very important. So I just want you guys to know that we are trying our best to put something, put this on for you now. We may try and get another one in before the end of the year, if at all possible. So that's something else that we're looking into, but, sorry, I'm trying to read them as we're going. So anyway, if you have any questions, like I said, send it through the counties. You want to go to the next one? All right. So again, this is our very first session. For anyone. We haven't done any of this at any time. But we are really interested in seeing how this actually plays out. So instead of sitting through a half a day or a whole day, or we've done a couple days, like couple half days, or, this is giving us a chance to just sit down with you for an hour, hour and a half, have a conversation about one topic in particular, because we know that these are questions coming out. I know you guys are all like biting at the, waiting, we got to talk about it. So we're hoping these smaller segments might give you more valuable information in real time. Okay, so you're not waiting for the next bulletin to come out. You're not waiting for the next conference to come out or anything like that. And we're hoping to maybe even incorporate these from here on out. This wouldn't be just a COVID thing, a 2020 thing, but this could possibly be something as we move on down the road. So virtual trainings, we kind of touched on that a little bit. We did, you know, the big virtual trainings. Those are, we've done them all different ways. I mean, all different ways. So Lori and I do come into the office. We are in the Indy office today. We have better internet here. It's more reliable. It's from the tech side, that kind of eases my nerves to be here so that I don't have to really worry about it on that side. I live in a very rural community. My internet is not great. So from home. So, you know, we're trying to set up here. We're hoping, again, that these smaller segments are going to lead to maybe even a better understanding and maybe some more participation, okay? We're going to leave it to very important topics if we can, going on into the future. Things that, you know, you really, like I said, really need to know right now. And this also gives us an opportunity to collaborate with, you know, other agencies. So, you know, Election Division has collaborated with us on this. They are, Brad's here. I know Angie's having a little bit of trouble connecting. I'm going to move to her here in just a minute. But they're going to be here as a resource. But they worked with us behind the scenes on all of this because we understand that this is a topic that I don't think Lori and I realized was quite as big as it is. We didn't understand all of the ins and outs. So Brad and Angie really helped us get that better understanding as we're moving forward. Okay, I think that's all I've got.
Okay.
I think I'm going to hand it over to Lori.
Okay. Love these handouts. Okay, so Ricky's already talked about it. This year has been unprecedented, and we are certainly still working in uncertain times. Things seem to change daily or even hourly, and it's hard to get ahead of anything. And there's certainly no denying that COVID-19 affected your primary election big time for every single county. It was necessary for you guys to adapt to changing rules for social distancing, courthouse closing, election workers that were fearful to work during this environment, and even sometimes a positive result that closed your courthouse down that day or closed or took out your entire staff of election workers because they all were exposed during a training. We know precincts were moved and sometimes combined. And we understand, we get that you were doing the best you can, and it's remarkable because it all got done. I mean, it's just amazing what you were able to put together and pull off to get that election through. And so we're kind of in awe on you on that. However, we know it wasn't easy, and we know where there's some issues, and especially after you got through the election and we're trying to get claims paid, that problems came up. And that's really what we're trying to focus on here. The majority of the problems, there were others, but the majority seemed related to compensation for your election workers. And really that's the focus of this short session. We did have clerks that have reached out to us and to the election division regarding issues they were having, and we've tried to cover those topics within this, clarify those issues. We will be going over this information, the same exact presentation we are going to do for the auditors in October. So they're going to hear the same thing you're hearing. So we hope that helps clarify some of the communication as well. Brad King and Angela Nussmeyer are both available and listening, and they'll be able to answer questions that Ricky and I certainly can't, because we're really looking on the accounting side of it, not the election side. So where they overlap, or if there are questions of process or procedure, they'll be here to answer those questions. So send those in as well. And as Ricky said, we learned a lot just collaborating with the election division on this. I think we kind of knew in the back of our minds that elections were made up of a lot of moving parts, but I don't think we were ever aware of the effort needed to coordinate all of those moving parts into a successful election process. And so again, if you have questions as we're going through these, please send those in. Ricky will be monitoring those. We'll stop if we need to and answer those questions, or have Angie or Brad answer the questions that come in. So we're going to be kind of free with that apart. So don't worry about that. Send it through the chat or email, either one. So working on this and putting all this information together, I think there's been a lot of confusion on terms that are used, not just with elections, but just overall. So this is a very high level view when we're talking about compensation. And so I put some of those definitions on here so we kind of have a working base to come off of. So an employee works for and under the direction of an employer that hires them. The employer sets the hours, the location the work is performed, the policies and rules of the employment. On the other hand, an independent contractor is a person who, usually under a contract, provides a specific service or project, and your county's contract with one or more entities, even now, to provide services. Think about things like your attorney, an accountant, a consulting firm, a software vendor. You have construction contractors. All of those work under a contract where they're not an employee, they're independent, but they work to provide those services. This is a very black and white, and in reality, it's not quite that black and white. There's so many variations of these situations. It's not always an easy distinction to make. For example, a county may contract with a legal firm for legal guidance, or they may hire an attorney to work for the county. Sometimes they do both. They hire an attorney to attend maybe all of their public meetings. At the same time, they have a separate contract with the attorney's law firm to provide any additional guidance. So it can get a little blurry. Why does this matter? Well, the IRS cares, and they have rules about reporting income, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. State and federal labor laws are applied to employees, but not contractors. Whether the county has to pay employer taxes or provide benefits will also depend on the status of the individual as an employee or independent contractor. An employee's compensation is reported on a W-2, while an independent contractor will receive a 1099 for payment of services over $600 in 1 year. An employee is covered by state's labor laws, while an independent contractor is not. Usually, the contract itself would govern the terms of their services. An employer would also have to maybe pay a share of Social Security and Medicare, but they would not pay that for an independent contractor. Having gone through all that, election workers are a whole separate classification of workers. The IRS does have very specific guidelines for election workers, and when their compensation is reported and when, if any, withholdings are needed. I took information directly from their website to use in this presentation. However, I don't speak for the IRS. If there is any clarification that is needed, it would have to come from the IRS, a specific situation that maybe doesn't fit any of this. I copied the link here so you can go and look at the information directly on the website. And then if it doesn't answer your question, you may have to reach out to them. You can send you can try to call, but you can also send in written requests and they will answer them for your specific situation and your specific terms. And I just want to add, and again, I'm trying to make sure that we have some coordination between the auditor's office and the clerk's office on this. From the auditor's perspective, it's important that they follow the IRS guidelines. If they are audited by the IRS and counties have been audited and they are found to be out of compliance, there are penalties that can be assessed against the county. Our uniform compliance guidelines require that compensation be paid in a manner that will facilitate compliance with state and federal reporting requirements. It also states that officials and employees who have a responsibility to perform duties in a manner which would not result in unreasonable fees being assessed against the unit. So any penalties or interest or other charges paid by the county could be the personal obligation of the responsible official. And so they've got a lot writing on reporting correctly. So there's a lot, they're gonna have to work through all of this, but there is a lot writing on that as well. There is an Indiana code that we were not aware of until we collaborated with the election division that does say the status of appointment of your precinct election officers. Those are, and I've written or included the statute here, those are by state law considered independent contractors. Okay. So this includes any precinct election officer is considered an independent contractor. But do remember, this statute will not supersede federal tax law, such as the IRS code. So for determining compliance, for example, if you were looking at Indiana Code 359 about a government employee holding a position on a board, it would affect that. These are not employees, so they could be on a board, things like that. And the last thing on this slide I want to talk about, and we're going to talk about in a little more detail, is that compensation for election workers, they fall under your county budget, so and your salary ordinances. So one of those two places. So even for the positions that are considered independent contractors, the individuals do not negotiate their own compensation. That is set by a governing board, and those appropriations to pay that compensation are set by the budget. So those are things we have to keep in mind. I'm having trouble getting it to move. Okay. With all that being said, there were some things that came to our attention after the primary election that we want to be clear. And again, I will be going over this with your auditors in October. Election workers are a special group of workers hired solely for the election process. They do not need to be trained, or they do need to be trained by the election board on their election duties, but they are not new or seasonal employees of the county. There is no need for them to go through an onboarding or new employee training or have to listen to information on benefits and pensions or personnel policies that really don't apply to them. There is absolutely no need for an election worker to have to be trained on internal controls. Just as an added note, not all employees have to be trained on internal controls. In Indiana Code 5-11-1-27, which it talks about the internal controls, only personnel whose official duties include receiving, processing, depositing, or otherwise having access to funds that belong to the federal government, such as grants, state government, or a political subdivision, need to be trained on internal controls. Election workers don't collect any fees. They don't make any deposits. They don't file any claims even. So there's no need for them to be trained on internal controls. The training by the election board should be the only training that they would need. Again, they don't need to know about paid time off. They're not going to earn any. They don't need to go about all those policies. If there is a particular personnel policy that would affect them, that could be included in the training the election board does. So the first thing Ricky and I needed to learn about were all the different positions involved in elections and the statutes around those positions. And the election division graciously provided our schooling on this and gave us really great information to use. Again, there are a lot of moving parts within the county, and it is inspiring to know how all of this comes together to make an election work. Although you probably are already more familiar with the classifications than we are, I think the structure helps us get on the same page, so I'm going to go through it. And again, I'll be going over this with the county auditors as well, the exact same presentation. For your absentee voting, we all realize that the volume of absentee votes just went through the roof with the primary election because everybody could vote absentee. They didn't need any reason to do that. We're going to talk about budgets a little later, but this is one of the areas I think where the budgets were simply not sufficient for the amount of additional work that was required due to the health emergency. And then the executive order allowing those absentee ballots could be filed for any reason during the primary election. So everybody, it just increased your volume so much. But your absentee voting board, and I've put in the Indiana code up here that was provided, they have a per diem set by county council, and they can also receive, their travel board members also receive a sum set for mileage by county council. The absentee ballot counter and absentee courier, and the statute is here, have a per diem set by the commissioners, but they can also receive a mileage set by the county council. The couriers can. So your election day workers, your inspector, poll judge, poll clerk, poll assistant clerk, poll sheriff, the Indiana code is there. They have a per diem fixed by the county commissioners. And that's the same for your vote center workers. Okay, and again, this is where the statute says that these are the workers that are considered independent contractors under state law. I don't think this was so much a budget issue. The way absentee voters, the staff you need to do your absentee votes. We did hear of issues regarding compensation, so we're going to talk about those, especially when your precincts had to be changed. For your county election board, their compensation is determined by the county council, and then the board itself sets a reasonable rate of compensation for your canvass clerical assistants and write-in counting team and your provisional ballot counters. Oh, sorry, they receive a per diem. It gets very confusing. Their per diem comes from the county fiscal body. So you can see it's a real mix-up of who decides what each person is getting paid. So let's talk about budgets a little bit. You're already familiar with budgets. You guys do budgets for your office. They are very important to the operation of the county. For the county council, it really is their main responsibility. Each county has finite resources, which is funds or cash, to pay for the operating and capital costs of the county, and the budget is one of the main ways to control those finite resources. In order to disperse funds, there has to be sufficient money in the fund, so the fund balance has to be able to support it. There has to be sufficient permission to spend that money, which is called an appropriation. In order for the budget to be approved, it has to be fully funded based on current fund balances and projected revenues to that fund. As we've already discussed, there was no way to budget for the disruption caused by the COVID pandemic. For the primary election, not only did you have the increase in absentee votes, again, you had to adapt for social distancing at polling locations, provide sufficient PPE for your election workers, new protocols for disinfecting surfaces commonly used by everyone who was voting. There is provision within budgeting laws for emergency and unforeseen demands on county resources, such as the pandemic, to allow for the changes in how we do our additional appropriations. We will not be taking exception to overspending the budget during the pandemic. We know that was inevitable. Everybody had to do it. However, the budgets do need to be made whole for the year, and so we're going to talk about them. On our SBO website, since we hadn't talked about it yet, on the home page, we have links to all of the directives, policies, and procedures that we issued, the State Board of Accounts issued in response to the pandemic. We also have links to DLGF memos, the governor's executive orders, and other agencies. So if you ever want to see what's out there, if you go to our homepage and scroll down just a little bit, they're all listed there so that you have the same access to that information. Okay, so for elections, the first step in the budgeting process, excuse me, is for the election board to prepare an annual budget estimate. I would guess that often falls on the clerk. Based on historic costs and any anticipated costs for the next year, the board would set the estimated budget, submit that to the county in the manner as all other budgets are submitted to the county for the council process to determine the overall budget. And I've listed here where in the Indiana Code the budget, the information on the budget, starting with the county election board is. So there's another code for the commissioner's budget estimate. And in that, it says the county executive shall prepare an itemized estimate of all money to be drawn by the members of the executive and all the expenditures to be made by the executive or under its order during the next calendar year. Each executive budget estimate must include, there are several numbered under there, but 7 is the estimated number of precincts in the county, the amount required for election expenses, including compensation of election commissioners, inspectors, judges, clerks, and sheriffs, rent, meals, hauling, and repair of voting booths and machines, advertising, printing, stationery, furniture, and supplies. So all of that goes to the commissioners for them to put together in their budget estimate to the council. And again, as we've already discussed, and you're really very well aware of, the budget estimate that you guys did in 2019 and turned in, that the commissioners then turned in for the 2020 budget, could just just could not have anticipated all the additional expenses that were going to be required. There were executive orders of the governor. There were memos that we released. There was information from DLGF on additional appropriations to try to deal with this as you were going. And really, I think you were making day-by-day decisions to try to handle this. Some of this I've already talked about. Okay. The upshot of all of that is that we were doing the best we can. We, as a state, we were doing the best we can to get through everything and continue to provide governmental services, including elections, to our citizens. And as I said, we're very aware of that. So when we're auditing 2020, all of that's going to be forefront, and we are not going to be nitpicking every little decision that was made. You had to make those decisions. You had to go forward. However, we want to make sure that in doing that, we didn't just throw everything out the window. The information is still, the laws are still there. The statutes on how to do budgets are important. All of that still exists, even though we kind of blew it up during the primary election. And we need to try to make that whole again, especially before. That's why we want to do this earlier, as you're going into your general election, that you're trying to make sure that you've got the appropriations you need in place to go forward with your general election expenses. So when the original budget is reviewed by the commissioners and added to theirs, then that goes to the council. And the council is the one that makes the final budget. How did that happen?
I don't know, my computer's frozen.
Oh, I'm not. How do I can't unmute. Sorry. I can't hear it. Why is it doing that?
I don't know, my computer's frozen.
What do we do?
Is your speaker volume down?
Muted.
Are you muted on there?
Is it okay?
Ask them, are you guys hearing a feedback?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, bear with us for just a second.
Okay, is that better?
Sounds better
Yes.
here.
Okay. What are these things?
It may have made you host. Are you host by chance?
Yes, I am host.
Ha. Oh.
So it unmuted me at the same time, I think.
Sorry, everybody. My computer froze, and it was all on mine. Is it recording?
Up here.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Perfect. I guess. Go for it. I'm gonna restart my computer then.
Okay. Okay, we're back in business. Okay. So, council has to approve approve the overall budget for the county, that budget then has to be approved by Department of Local Government Finance. The budget has to be advertised to the public. Once it's advertised, the budget can't exceed the amount advertised. Any additional appropriations have to be advertised, approved by the council, and approved by DLGF. And that approval by DLGF will depend on the fund balance and estimated revenues for that fund. If there's not sufficient cash balance or additional revenue anticipated, they will not approve the additional appropriations. Again, we talked about it. There are limited resources to pay operating expense. The budget is how those limited resources are allocated throughout the county. So your courthouse operations, your sheriff, your health, your highway, your courts, etc. The COVID emergency added costs not only for the clerks, but it also added for the health department, public safety workers, and other departments as well. So there was a lot of stress on that budget at that time. It is also important to note that the second part of the budget work by the council includes determining compensation amounts for all of the positions where the council sets the compensation. And in the previous slides, we went over who, by statute, sets the compensation for your election workers. Sometimes it is the council, sometimes it's commissioners, and sometimes by the election board themselves. Any changes in that compensation would have to be approved by the governing board that approved the original compensation. So this was a fairly common issue within the primary election, where the compensation was changed to accommodate the issues brought forth by COVID, and those were not always, the changes were not always set or approved by the appropriate governing board. So this caused issues in getting the claims for compensation paid. When improving claims for the expenditure, auditor's office needs to make sure that there's sufficient cash balance in the fund to pay all of the disbursements. There is sufficient appropriation. And as stated earlier, we will not take exception to overspending the budget in June. So that really should not have been part of the problem then, but it could have been a holdup. In addition, they have to verify the amount paid is in agreement with the compensation approved for these positions. Another thing is we will not take audit exception if at any time, this is not just during an emergency, if a change in compensation other than for an elected official is approved retroactively. So for example, if compensation is changed for the poll workers and the per diem was set by the commissioners, and the commissioners could change that per diem after the primary, make that a change effective for the primary, and we would not take exception to that. But it's the commissioners that would have to make the change in that case. So this is kind of a review of the information, setting out who's setting the compensation. And again, you need to keep that in the back of your mind, because you need to know who you need to go for approval if you need to change this compensation. So the commissioners, they set the per diems for the poll workers, as well as the vote center workers, which makes sense because that's part of determining the budget for your election expenses. The election board then sets the compensation for the campus clerical assistants and writing counting team. And again, they're going to include that in their estimate for the budget when they give that to the commissioners. So for all of these positions, the budget was set knowing what the compensation amount should be. Changing these amounts obviously affected the budget, and it needs to be part of the process. The health emergency literally pulled all of our known structures out from under us. We can't go back and change the decisions that we made during the primary. However, going forward, we can establish policies and procedures that not only support statute, but allow for some flexibility for you to be able to deal with these types of emergencies in the future. Kind of goes back a little bit what Ricky was saying about an ongoing continuity of service plan. For an example, when you needed to combine precincts in one location and your workers were covering more than one precinct, how should they be paid? Again, that would be a county decision. Should they receive twice the per diem if they're covering two? Should they receive 1.5 times if they're covering two? That would be a county decision, but that has to be set by the appropriate governing board. And so if you set that going in, knowing that if that would happen again during the general election, how are we going to deal with it? You'll already know in advance your county's decision is to do it this way. And that way, you can make the changes that you need to make, inform your workers of how the changes are going to affect them, and it's not going to be a surprise to your commissioners, your council, or your auditors when they're filing those claims. As I alluded to earlier, the IRS does require that some election compensation has to be reported. Again, as we stated, the county has to comply with IRS requirements for reporting, or there are potential penalties that can be imposed against the county. If there are any questions on the reporting requirements, again, you can go directly to the IRS with your specific situation and ask for written guidance on that, or call them. It's probably easier to do the writing. But based on the information that's on the website that I gave you the link to earlier, we're going to go over some of those situations. So when an election worker makes less than $600 from the county, from any source in the county in 1 year, the county is not required to report any of those wages. This is obviously the simplest case for all concerned, and probably the easiest one. With the increase in hours for some election workers, they are making or will make more than the $600 from the county in the year. And note I said or will make. It is estimated an election worker would make less than $600, and at the end of the year, it turns out they made more than that because of these changes that had to be made. The county has to have procedures and processes in place to flag those employees as needing a W-2 for the year. Per the information on the website, any election worker that makes more than $600 is required to receive a W-2 from the county, from the employer. If you have an employee of the county that is working the election, the hours for the election work need to be added to the compensation from their regular job in order to determine when a W-2 is needed. In most cases, I really can't think of an example, or wouldn't be this way, but in most cases, this will exceed $600. And for that reason, we have recommended to the county auditors that the pay for election workers that are county employees go through payroll, because they're already in the system that way. One of the things we're not discussing right now, but does merit disclosure, is that the IRS does not require any income tax withholding from election workers. But once you reach a certain threshold, then you have to withhold from Medicare and Social Security. And again, the county is going to have to track that. And that's why we say for employees of the county, it's just really important that they run through payroll and not be paid separately. On the last bulletin, I just wanted to point out, because this did come up during the primary election, when your deputies, your clerk deputies, are being tasked with election duties for both payroll claim and for audit purposes, you need to be very clear on what duties are being performed, what pay rate is in effect for those duties, and it needs to be clear for both turning in the claims and for the auditor to process those claims. If they are performing their deputy clerk duties separate from their election worker duties, that needs to be shown. So you know what hours we're doing and who needs to get, and what they need to be paid for those hours. Okay. Changing the compensation of your deputies would require the council to approve and modify the salary ordinance. So if you are going to pay them more because they've taken on additional duties, you've got to get the salary ordinance modified. That can be done retroactively, but you need to take that extra step. So we're going to go through some examples. Again, these are very simple. Obviously, you can run into a lot of different scenarios that can come up, and if there's more information required, we're back to you're going to have to contact the IRS on that. But these are some of the simple examples I could get directly from what was on the website. So we have Betty retired, and she is working the primary election as a poll clerk. She has consistently worked elections for her county and will probably work the fall election. But her total compensation for both the primary and the election will be $550. She does not need a W-2. She just gets her $550 and goes on her merry way over the two times. Okay, this is again probably the most simple and direct and the easiest. example 2, we have Susie Coed. She decides to work the election since all her classes are online right now and she has the time. So she works as an absentee vote counter. And due to the increased number of absentee votes during the primary, she works more hours than is usually required for that position. Her pay for the primary is $950. Because Susie earns more than the $600, she needs a W-2 for her election earnings. Unlike Ms. Betty, she has to get the W-2 at year end. Her record needs to be flagged in some way to track that she needs that W-2. There have to be controls in place through the county, through the auditor's office that's going to be processing the claims to make sure that these workers are tracked and their compensation is reported properly. She doesn't have any withholdings. We're not saying that, but she does have to have that $950 reported on a W-2 at the end of the year. Okay, now we have Joe County. He works for the county health department. The courthouse is closed for the primary. He decides to help out and work as a poll inspector. He has earned $300 for the election work. His election earnings are below $600, but you have to consider his compensation from the county as a whole. So for both his job in the health department and for his election earnings. And if the total compensation exceeds $600 for the year, then his election earnings have to be on a W-2 as well. The county can issue 2 separate W-2s, so if they have separate tracking for this, they can issue 2, but both of the regular earnings and the election earnings have to be on a W-2. And again, we're not addressing the other payroll requirements, such as paying Social Security and Medicare, which would need to be paid on the election earnings of a county employee, which is why we always recommend that the county employee payments go through payroll, since there are controls in place for issuing the W-2, for withholding, and doing the matching. We're going to be talking about claims in a little bit. The second thing I want to note, again, is if you have your clerk deputies fulfill some of the duties for election workers, you need to keep in mind. Now, if your deputy is very similar to Joe here and does not have any election duty responsibilities, they have the day off and they're just working that day, they're going to be treated exactly the same way as we did for the health department worker. Where the waters get a little muddy and when it caused some problems during the primary election is if you have your deputy clerks that have election responsibilities also working doing both, and to be very clear on what they were doing. Okay. So the basic underlying principle is you can't pay the worker twice for the same hour. Now, we're not talking about paid time off, which if it's a holiday, they're not working, but if they're working and they're getting wages, they can't get 2 different salaries for the same hour. You can increase their salary that they're getting, okay? But you can't just add the election pay on top of the compensation they're receiving as a clerk deputy. So if they are, and again, you have to be clear what you're doing. If you've added work to them that they didn't normally have, and you want to increase their compensation, you need to go and have the salary modified for that. If they are doing, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but if they are doing work at other times, so maybe they're working their regular clerk duties during the day and they're doing some work in the evenings or something in their own time, then they still have to have the W-2, but you can separate those out. But that's clearly showing when they're working as an election worker and when they're working as a deputy for the clerk's office. I know this is confusing. It's hard to talk about, but question that came up to us after, no one was really clear on exactly how this was working. What hours were they working? What pay rate should they have? So you need to be really, really clear going forward exactly what you're paying them and where the authority to pay them is. Their regular salary, election work that they're doing on their own time. Okay. Now we're going to talk about payment methods. There's really 3 different ways that we're going to discuss how you get compensation paid. again, it's the county auditor's responsibility to audit all the county claims and vouchers prior to their allowance and payment. For personal services or compensation, they need to determine that the salaries or the rate of wages are in strict accordance with those fixed by county council or by the board or officer having jurisdiction. When the claims received do not line up with those established salary ordinance, budget, per diems, etc., that causes a pause in the payment until those variances can be researched and determined which is correct, which is slowing down your payroll payments. And we don't want that. In addition, the county auditor needs to determine that sufficient funds and appropriations are available from which to make the payment. DLGF did provide guidance on additional appropriations during the public health emergency, and that made allowance for those additional appropriations to be approved at a later date. And again, we are not taking any exception to overspending the budget during that June election. But that doesn't mean that the budget's no longer important. It is still important. Even though we have a way to shorten the process to make sure those necessary expenses were paid, they still have to go through the approval process, maybe at a later date, but you still have to approve those additional appropriations. Okay, there was a steep learning curve for all of us in this, for the clerk's office, for your auditor's office, for us as well in providing guidance on all of this. And we're all trying to get through the best we can. We understand that you were doing the same thing. So we all need to practice patience as we sometimes stumble our way through these to come up with a resolution. And so that's, very important. I think one of the things that we learned during the primary election is that we need to establish some patience to keep those communication lines open and get these things resolved so people get paid what they're supposed to get paid. So the PRE2 is really your workhorse for your election compensation. You're all familiar with that. For workers on election day, this form allows you to summarize the payments needed. There may be positions that are not county employees, but they're not on this form, okay? I think one that came up was maybe a mechanic for your electronic poll book or your electronic vote thingy.
Voting systems.
Thank you, voting systems, Brad. Thank you. I'm dying here. So they're on the PRE2, and so maybe they need a different way. You need a different way to be able to get them paid. Okay, and as we said, we really recommend that if the employee is an employee of the county, that it go through payroll. So let's look at those. You're already more familiar with these than I am. The election division did receive requests to alter this form, and there are a lot of considerations to be made before we implement those kinds of changes. Changing a state form is not easy. It would be difficult, if not almost impossible, to complete it before the year was ended, because as a state form, it takes more work and reviews before the changes can be considered completed and approved. We don't want to jump to making changes if it's not necessary. So for the issue that came up during the primary election, some clerks were modifying this form to add positions that are not pre-printed on here, and what we would recommend is that you not do that. Use the form exactly as it's set out to be used for the positions that were already on here and the expenses that are on here. For other positions, like we said, like a mechanic, they may not be making more than the $600 threshold, and they still need a way, if they are, to flag them for a W-2. But it's possible, rather than using this form, that you would then use the 17. And you should be familiar with this form, because this is the means of requesting payment from your operating budget for all of the expenses throughout the year. It is possible to pay compensation from a 17. We discussed earlier about independent contractors being paid under contract, like your attorney or your consultant, your software vendors, etc. They would be paid through the use of this form. And again, for the mechanic, you could probably put them on here. I was not clear on how your county, counties may have different ways of doing this, but how they are determining the amount for that. I don't know if your election board sets it up. It should be probably part of your budget. They may work under contract, I don't know. But that position is not on the PRE2, so you need to use the 17. And then follow whatever authorization for payment is there. If there's a contract, attach it. If there's, if the election board sets it, attach the minutes from the election board where they determine that amount to be paid, just so that you've got all of your documentation together for payment of this amount. Finally, I put the payroll schedule in here. Just again, you're all familiar with this. And as we discussed, for county employees that are working on the election, they're going to need the W-2. There's going to be withholding requirements for Medicare and Social Security out of their election earnings that need to be considered. So the payroll is really the easiest way to track all of that. So we think you should really include any county employees on you can have a separate payroll schedule for the election, but include them on that so that they can track all of that information. So to remember that the county auditor is auditing all of these claims to make sure that the amount paid ties to an approved compensation amount. If the improved compensation amount is not already available to the auditor's office, make sure you submit a copy of the documentation, whether it's in an ordinance or a board minutes or contracts or whatever supports that. If your compensation amount has changed, make sure that the appropriate board has approved the changes. And this approval is provided to the auditor as well. And the appropriate board, again, is the board that was given the authority, the statutory authority to set the compensation in the first place. So if the compensation is set by the county council, then if there's a change in the compensation, it's got to come from county council. Okay. And even though there have been changes in how you ask for and get additional appropriations during this pandemic, the budget is still important and it should be considered with any expenses that would exceed the appropriation line approved in the budget. Any additional appropriations have to be fully funded. Again, there has to be sufficient cash balance to pay these costs. Any additional appropriations that are going to be needed for the general election, you should be seeking those now before the election. So your election board could reevaluate the budget of the amount that's used to date, what they think will still be needed for the general election, and request any additional appropriation now so that you have that amount set before you're going into your election. So we wanted to talk a little bit about lessons learned. Again, we can't go back and change what happened in June. We got through it. It all worked, and that's wonderful. But going forward, we think one of the big things is communication is key. Make sure everybody is on the same page as fully as possible. Provide changes to support your claims. Make sure your budget is still working or that additional appropriations are needed. Those have been requested. Think about any unanticipated costs in reference to your budget. If you've spent more in your primary, work on getting your additional appropriations approved. If there were any issues that popped up during the primary, try to get resolutions and get a plan in place for the general election. So we're telling you, plan ahead. If you had to combine precincts and needed to change the per diems, make sure that the appropriate boards have given approvals or set schedules of payments for workers when this situation might happen again, whether it's this year or next year or the year after that. Have those things in place. And again, I've said this a number of times, we know everyone did the best they could under very trying situations for that primary election. We get that. We understand that. It'll certainly be reflected when we're auditing for all departments during the pandemic. The health emergency, it hasn't ended yet. We're hopeful that it will, but it may continue into next year. But please don't think that because, sometimes things become precedent for something else. We've always done it that way. Don't let this year become the we always done it that way, because what we're doing here were a lot of workarounds to make it work. So try to make your future plans work within what the statute requires, what the budget requires, if at all possible. And I think that is everything. Yeah, I like that. not as good at this as Ricky is, so give me patience. How do I do that? I didn't even see you in there.
Scroll down at the top. Hit view all attendees. Find me. Right there.
Yeah. Okay.
And put make panelists.
I'm learning something new every day.
There were a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
But my computer froze and I was unable to get them, so I
Okay.
there were at least two when I but I don't have access to them, so you'll have to. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Angela said you answered hers.
Okay, I have clerk office staff working elections. These workers receive regular hour pay. This is allowed, correct? Yes, if they're receiving the pay they're supposed to receive, that's been authorized for them to receive for the duties that they're doing, yes. If you give them additional duties that weren't part of their original and you want to pay them more, that's when you need to work on changing changing the salary ordinance to include those. So if you give them more work and you say, I'll pay you more because you're going to have to do more work, that's where you're going to need to change it. But if they are doing their deputy clerk duties, they get their deputy clerk duty pay for that work. And I have them paid from election overtime budget, not, the rest of it's not there. Yes, I mean, that's fine. You've got a line in your budget for that. Still unclear on paying clerk staff who work on election while all county workers are on holiday. Okay, they can receive their holiday pay because that's paid time off. That's a benefit to all of your employees. So just like the health worker, if they're taking their day off to work, they can get both their regular salary for that as well as the holiday pay. You have to be clear on, are they doing their clerk duties that day or are they working as an election worker, so that you know what amount they should be paid. Does that make sense, or is that making it worse? That was my question.
There's another one up about, maybe that was Angela's. That was about per diem. Who determines the rate of pay for clerk staff on election day?
Depends on what the clerk staff is doing. If they're doing their regular deputy clerk duties, then that's what's on the salary ordinance for them to be paid for that work. If they're working as, they don't have any election duties and they're just working the election day as an election worker, then they're going to be paid the per diem that's set for that position as an election worker.
Two I saw came in like fairly early.
See, my little window's not very big. My auditor keeps telling that any person that works for the county already that, yes, that we recommend if you are a county employee that your pay, your election pay, go through payroll.
There was one about
Is it acceptable for the council to set a per hour rate for absentee walk-in board members instead of a per diem? Brad?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
Is it acceptable for the council to set a per hour rate for absentee walk-in board workers instead of a per diem.
The statute, as I recall, refers to compensation. I'm looking at it. 36626, which covers the poll workers, and it just refers to compensation. It does use per diem in 36625. So that implies for at least the poll workers that it's not an hourly rate, it's a set figure.
So if the statute says compensation, you're probably okay, but if it says specifically a per diem, then you're probably going to have to follow statute on that and figure out, I mean, you kind of know how many hours they'll be working, right?
Well, I hate to complicate this further,
Oh,
but
no.
yeah, but state law does provide an option for a particular poll worker position, let's say a poll clerk on election day, a voting site, to work a 6-hour shift and be replaced at noon by another person.
Okay.
And some counties do that. And so I would think in that case that the ordinance, which the county commissioners in this case adopt in most counties, would specify the amount to be paid for that half day.
That would work for us as far as audit purposes.
I have a follow-up question, if you would permit me, and that is,
Right ahead.
in other parts of election law, the election division, will share model templates for various resolutions, ordinances, etc. First part of my question is, do you have a particular example that you've come across during an audit that was an A+ ordinance that was comprehensive and addressed many of the issues we're talking about, and would be willing to share with those who wish to use it as a comparison or model? And then secondly, just a comment, it might be worth, if you haven't had a conversation as a county clerk with your county attorney, to have that conversation. In most counties, not the largest, the county attorney represents both the county council and county commissioners, to see whether they might want to consider adopting, I would assume, an ordinance prior to November if what they have is not sufficient to deal with the issues that are being addressed today. That was my comment.
That's very good advice. I would certainly echo that one. We don't normally make copies of things that are A+, but if a county has gotten through it, and had an FEC that they really liked it, I mean, they could share it, but we don't normally keep that in the work papers. We're unfortunately more focused on what doesn't work than what does when we're auditing, and so we wouldn't have it.
We wouldn't maintain it because it would change from year to year too. So if it was something that was like an everlasting thing, sometimes we do keep those, but in this instance, I can't imagine we have one.
I understand that. You've raised one other question. Is there anything that would preclude a county from adopting an ordinance in 2020 and having it remain in effect until the county chooses to alter it? In other words, I don't know that there's a requirement in statute for the county commissioners or county council to set the compensation or per diem each time an election is held, or even each calendar year.
Right. No, we would not require that. They would need to make sure they can bring it forward because it supports that budget for that year, but they don't have to change it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the salary ordinance is done every year, but the compensation set by the commissioners or by the election board could just be set one time until it's changed.
Okay, thank you.
I'll check the email. I don't have anything else coming in. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Okay, nothing in the box. Is there any other questions? Everybody has this crystal clear. It's perfect in every way. Lori did such an excellent job.
And again, we will be going over this with the auditors so that we're all hopefully on the same page before November.
I did want to say that these questions that have come up, and hopefully we can pull them all. I may have to rewatch the recording since my computer froze. We will try and include them into the next bulletin, which will go out in December. So we'll have these questions in there again. Obviously, it's after the fact. But if during, right after the election, these questions come up, give us a call. We'll try and walk you through the scenario because I'm sure there are some obscure scenarios out there we haven't even thought of yet. We'll try and help you out. Again, I'm going to try with the questions. Since my computer froze, I'm not 100% sure I can grab them all, but I will try to grab as many as I can. Like I said, if I have to rewatch part of it, I can do that too. So is there anybody else that has any questions? Want to use the chat box or anything? Angie hadn't said anything the whole time. She's muted right now. Angie, is there anything you'd like to add?
Oh, no, thank you. You guys did an excellent job. Thanks for making time and pulling this all together. It's been really helpful and instructive for me, especially. I just appreciate you walking through everything with a fine-tooth comb.
That's us. Anal to the last. Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much for participating in this. Are you sending out a survey on this?
Yes, I am. I'm going to send out a survey on it. If you could be as honest as you can about these little sessions, because, we're hoping to use these as a tool moving forward. Again, not to take over one of your conferences or anything like that. We'd still have our June conference. That is the plan. Just something as in addition to. Okay, so I'll try and get that out. Probably not going to be this week. It's probably going to be Monday. So I'll try and get it out as soon as I can. I'll send out an email with the link to the survey on it. It's anonymous, so be as honest as you want. I won't know who said what.
We might cry for a few days, but we'll get over it.
But we really, really appreciate you all tuning in. We hope that you learned a little bit of something. The presentation's up on there. When we get the recording, it will be placed with the presentation. We keep them together on the website under presentations and training materials. But again, I will notify you when that's up. And look out for the survey. All right. Well, we really appreciate y'all. We hope we get to see you all in June. Have a wonderful afternoon.
And good luck on your elections. We'll keep our prayers for you.
You're going to have to end it because you're host. And you have to stop recording. I think at the bottom. I don't know if it's changed.
Oh, here.
So, and it's